Hello, everyone, and welcome to the End of Sport. Today, we are going to talk about, well, I'm first of all joined by my wonderful friend, Johanna Mellis. Johanna, it's so good to see you on here.
Hi, it's so good to be here.
Yeah, they let me introduce this episode. I'm so excited, but I want to get right to it because we are going to talk about the top show right now, Heated Rivalry. We could not do an episode on it. And so today we are joined by two phenomenal scholars, people who are experts on hockey culture, LGBTQ identity, Canadian nationality, to really pick apart this show with us and why it's so big and what it really means from a critical sports perspective. So Joanna and I are joined today by Ryan Storr, who's a research fellow at Swinburne University of Technology and is founder of the Diversity Store. Ryan, hello from Australia is where you're coming in from, right?
Yes, yeah. And it's a bit cooler today. Yesterday it was 44 degrees Celsius.
A little steamy. Send some of that here because I think Joanna is like buried under the snow.
Terrible.
So we have Ryan here, and then we also have Kristi Allain, who is an associate professor of sociology and the Canada Research Chair in Physical Culture and Social Life at St. Thomas University in Fredericton, New Brunswick. Kristi, it's such a pleasure to have you here today, too.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me. We are like we've been minus 30 degrees Celsius for the last few days. Plus 44 seems very exciting.
So we have opposite ends of the spectrum and in terms of weather, but hopefully we can heat things up with our episode today as we get into it. I couldn't not say that.
Nice.
But yeah, super excited to both of you again for coming on the show and talking about this heated rivalry thing. Joanna, do you want to get us started on today's interview?
Yeah, so I am so glad that we're starting with this question because it's something that I've been thinking about so much, which is like, why has the show resonated with so many people and kind of why are people still talking about it? So why do you think it is that the show has gotten so much attention and that we are, a month and a half coming up on like 2 months out of the show starting to air, that people are still talking about it, critiquing it, having feelings, sharing online? What do you two think?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's one that I've thought about a lot. I think it's a combination of everything, and I think the fact when everything comes together that's made it the force that it is. Because I think one thing that maybe hasn't or doesn't get enough attention, I think, is the acting. Because look, as a gay man, seeing the scenes and certain things, whether it's a nightclub scene and all those type of things, I think the acting and the way they convey the emotions and even just look at each other and just the glance and the yearning and all those type of things, I think really hits hard and they really portray the kind of feelings. And I've watched I've actually watched a lot of times, but once I hosted like a viewing party with some gay friends, and it was really interesting because every kind of scene or something different hits somebody differently, whether it was like coming out or having a difficult experience coming out or having a relationship that was challenging and things like that. So I think it's a kind of a combination, because I'm still a bit dumbfounded with it, because like someone who does a lot of work in this space, especially from an LGBTIQ plus lens, normally there's backlash. You don't just get something and it's well received. It's normally there's concerted efforts to get it banned, or there's media pieces which are negative. So I was kind of always waiting for that to drop, and it just hasn't, and it's just been really positive. So I think it's like the combination, and I think as well, love or hate it and what it can do, sport does have currency. It's that kind of has that ability to draw people in, even if people weren't kind of necessarily following ice hockey and stuff. Like I know there's been stuff like about the boy aquarium and girls in particular going to see the ice hockey and things like that. So I think it's that combination, because as well the storyline is great. Like I've read the books as well, and I think it's kind of a good story and like topical around like situationships. It's like an 8-year situationships, and people can kind of relate to that type of thing. So I think it's the combination of things. And I think on a backdrop of the world is a pretty chaotic place, and especially, which maybe we'll talk about later, around the whole masculinity thing and are men in crisis and incels and red pills and blue pills and all that type of stuff. And I think one of the comments that I kind of read around why women particularly enjoy it is that it's romance without the misogyny. And I think especially for the female audience or the women audience, that really kind of hits.
It's an interesting moment, I think, of queer hope. I think, in Canada, we're coming off of a major sex scandal in elite level junior hockey, men's elite level junior hockey here. This is a moment that imagines, and I think, a lot of these fan fiction cultures imagine different imaginaries of sports that are celebrated, that feel important, that inform the nation. And there's just so much, like in Jacob Tierney's entire corpus of work from, he did, you may not know if you're not Canadian, but there's two other shows that are actually quite different, Letterkenny and Shoresy, that imagine hockey in this really new, interesting way, a hockey that's diverse, a hockey that's, open to change, not the closed community of, seemingly straight, white, middle-class, wealthy, able-bodied young men that is celebrated in the nation. It just seemed that people were ready to imagine men's team sports in new and innovative ways. And I think Ryan's comment about the viewing parties too, I think really speaks to, J.J. Wright's notion of queer joy that resonates when people get together and watch this. I've seen lots of little TikTok clips online of people watching this in bars together, hooting and laughing and,
Yes,
really enjoying this moment together, which is something, that we imagine a different space for watching hockey, so to speak, than the kind of bro-y hockey culture that exists in the men's, in arenas when we watch men's team sports in this way.
I love that. And I think the watch parties in sports bars is so important, and because of the space that it typically is in that. So was there an episode, scene, or line that really stood out to you across the 6 hours of Heated Rivalry? And why did it stand out to you? What resonated with you? I'm curious as a big fan.
For me, of course, it's the Scott and Kip moment on the ice. It's the, it kind of takes your breath away. It's so hopeful and so beautiful and so exciting, and also filled with the contradictions. I think the real life contradictions of the space, how hard it is, not hard it is to be out, but how sports erases any form, these kinds of men's team sports in particular, erase forms of queerness. And you hear the announcers saying, which made me laugh, they're like, oh, the fans getting a real treat tonight. And you're like, yes, that's exactly how it would be understood in the moment, right? That it's, as Michael Mesner says, some sports produce men as 100% straight, and just the announcer's inability to understand this as a coming out moment for Scott Hunter, I think was really interesting. I think people are so moved and touched by that, and also that, like, the way it resonates, the I'm coming to the cottage moment that follows that, when Ilya Rozanov announces, like, this has opened up space for me. And I think that it's just a really beautiful, hopeful moment, and one that really spoke to me.
I have two that kind of stand out. The first one is when they're at Ilya's flat and he gives him a ginger beer. Because I know with all the fandom and being down rabbit holes and all sorts and TikToks, like some of the reading interpretation stuff has been fascinating. And that particular scene I just think was really interesting because he already has the drink chilled in the fridge, and then afterwards he goes and tries to get a ginger ale with his parents at the restaurant in the bar, and he can't get it. But he has his drink, he knows him, he gets him, and he's got it waiting. And I think that was really powerful in terms of just these are two people who get each other. And I think sometimes trying to be understood and seen and things like that is not easy. So I think that kind of got me. But the other one, the main one that stood out to me, and it was a small one, but it was really powerful. And it's when they're on the bed in Florida, and he says, I think I'm gay. He says, yeah, so what? And he says, why are you telling me this? And then he says, who else am I going to tell? And I think the whole coming out in life and in sport and things like that is a really big thing that not many people might understand unless they've done it or they've had experiences with it. And the fact he feels like he can't tell anybody else but him shows you the connection and the safety And I think like sports organizations don't often understand. There's a kind of narrative of this idea, queer people, there's nothing stopping them playing from sport. Like, why can't they just go down to play sport? And this idea of kind of like safety and building an environment that you can tell someone. And it just kind of really hit me in the feels that he doesn't have anyone else that he feels that he could tell apart from Ilya, because obviously they have this special connection and bond. And I think that was a really, big one for me, because there was a scene in, I don't know if you've seen Love, Simon. It was a similar kind of TV show a couple of years ago. And there's one scene in particular where Simon basically is like a 16-year-old boy and he's gay and he's kind of navigating it. But someone kind of blackmails him and tells people. And there's a really powerful scene where he says, look, I only have this one opportunity to come out and it was taken away from me, and you can't understand the impact of that. So I think, the whole process of kind of coming out, inviting in who you share, who you tell, the circumstances that it happens can last a lifetime. So you kind of want to get it right. So that in particular, like, really stood out for me and kind of hit me hard.
Yeah, and I think all of these moments really lead us quite well to the next question, which is the fact that the show is like about identity and like how people are navigating their multifaceted identities through and with sports and outside a little bit, but really through sports. We have like gender expression, sexual orientation, national identity, ethnicity. We also have like disability. That was kind of something I connected with. I'm not autistic, but I have another disability, and like that has come out as part of as Shane's character too. And Shane being like, eventually figuring out that he's a gay Canadian player from Montreal who's Japanese and Canadian, whose parents are still married, and their own relationship with obviously gender and sexuality, but also race is like, I think, really interesting. And then we have Ilya, who's bisexual, Russian, can't be out at home by any means at all, right? The consequences for him are like so dire. And his family is going through their own turmoil, and he lives in Boston. And so how do you see their different identities navigating with each other, clashing or challenging kind of typical or normative ideas about masculinity, nationalism, whiteness, heterosexuality, et cetera, et cetera. And you can talk about the context you're familiar with or kind of North American hockey culture. And maybe we'll start with Ryan just to kind of go back and forth a little bit.
Yeah, look, I don't know as much around the Canadian context, but we'll definitely address that. For me, what I think is really interesting is, and I wrote a piece about this in my Substack, and I use the term men with diverse sexualities because I've got colleagues who do research in this as well, but I think it's really interesting around this idea of male sexuality in particular being black and white, and you kind of either like dudes or you don't. And I think it was really good, especially from kind of Ilya's perspective, around showcasing bisexuality, which I think is the largest letter in the acronym, but it's the least well misunderstood, and like from a research lens as well, there's not as much on it, I would say. But I think it kind of highlights that, because in the books, I believe that the term is men loving men. And within a sexual health policy, especially here in Australia, there's a term called MSM, men who have sex with men. And it's those who have sexual practices with other men, but do not identify as gay and don't identify with feelings and stuff. And I think within sport cultures, it's actually like, even just from research and informal interviews and things like that, I think it is quite common in reality that men do have sex or hook up with other men. But I think we're so far off kind of acceptance around that to like male professional athletes to be like, yep, I have sex with people of multiple genders. I think that's really interesting because I think we're a long way off that, but I actually think it's very common. And I know there was some research done from America with men in kind of quite remote areas, and when they are in Australia in the mines and these male dominated spaces where they might engage with men because that's the only option. So that was really interesting for me. And I think the the intersections of disability in particular, and how the kind of autism played out from Shane's perspective. Because I think in Australia, we're starting to, like, we have from the government an intersectionality framework that is starting to kind of translate into the sports system. But I think it's still quite, sports organizations and sports don't understand what it means. So I think it did a really good job around, the nationalism and things like that. Because I know I've interviewed people, and especially people from maybe migrant backgrounds, and often they kind of say, I'm not Australian enough, or I'm not accepted, or I'm not don't fit in with my community. And the same with disability. I interviewed LGBT people with disabilities a couple of years ago, and I remember they were kind of saying, when I go to queer spaces, my disabilities aren't really understood and it's not really inclusive. But then when I go to the disability spaces, I feel like I have to hide part of myself and I can't be fully myself because they don't understand the sexuality or gender diversity. So I think it kind of did a really good job of introducing people this idea that people can be in, if they want to put people in boxes, but there's actually multiple boxes out there, and how that actually impacts.
I think one thing that's really interesting is the ways that like fan fiction actually operates as a space to write people into these narratives, people who may have been written out from dominant hockey cultural frameworks, particularly men's hockey frameworks. And what we see here is Rachel Reed, despite, I mean, I know there's controversy about Rachel Reed and her rejection of, being an AO3 fanfic writer, which I think is where she got her start. And so, but those spaces, although, not deeply imperfect in lots of ways, are often spaces where people can write themselves back into narratives that they feel written out of. And what we see here, and I think in Jacob Tierney's entire work, is a writing back in of people into national narratives, into important national stories that have worked to systematically erase them. So, we see disability, we see mixed race folk, we see queerness written back into these stories in powerful ways that puts them sort of front and center, and allows a new idea of what it means to be Canadian hockey player, what it means to be National League hockey player, can sort of be rewritten by people. And I really wish that Rachel Reed had owned that more. And I owe part of this to a really smart graduate student, or a former graduate student that I've been speaking to, Elise Vist, who does all of their work has been on, or much of their work has been on hockey fan fiction, predating Heated Rivalry, and we've spoken a little bit about this in the days since the show came out. And I think it's a real tragedy for people who do this important work of writing folks back in, when Rachel denies that culture and the significance of it to rewriting scripts and reimagining spaces where queerness, where disability, where racialized folks may indeed be present, important, and central actors.
Yeah, and I think before Anna gets to the next question, I just wanted to say, I think back to the earlier question about, like, why is the discourse kind of still going? Like, why is this resonating with so many people, and why are people still talking about it? Like, I did some Instagram stories of the day, and I'm like, Stranger Things, the last season I was so excited about, but then, like, I watched it and it was over. Like, I didn't keep thinking about it. And I think the fact that the show, like fan fiction, as you're talking about, and other shows, allow people to reimagine the space. I think so many people want it to do more for them than, like, it does. And I think we should always, and again, someone who's more expert in literature and representation and within sports could say more about this, but I think people want more, which is why they're willing to engage with it and say, like, I think this is really good for X, and I also want it to be doing this too, which I personally don't see anything wrong with that. But I think that's another reason why it's kind of resonating with people a lot. So yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, and we do want better. I think that the, like, the overwhelming support of this means that, like, not just Canadians, but lots of people want sporting spaces to be more reflective of the worlds they live in and the things that matter to them. And that's, I think, where Heated Rivalry really resonates.
And I think being in that space of hockey is so interesting in terms of gender expression, sexual orientation, and also allyship. Because in your piece, Ryan, for the conversation with Kyle Rich, you wrote that the NHL was an early partner in inclusive sport movements like the You Can Play project and launched campaigns such as Hockey is for Everyone in attempts to reach wider audiences and celebrate diversity and inclusion in hockey. But in that same piece, you and Kyle also draw attention to the league's 2023 ban on pride tape and likening it to the Don't Say Gay policy in the US. So can you elaborate a bit more on the tensions between the hypermasculinity of hockey and queer inclusion in sport? And then in the context of Heated Rivalry, how are these tensions addressed, challenged, or maybe even at times reinforced?
I'll let Kristi talk more about the hockey culture part. She'll have a lot more to say. But I think what's interesting is that there's parallels everywhere. So using Sarah Ahmed's concept around non-performativity, this idea that organizations will make public speech and commitments around we are diverse, we will do this, we support LGBTIQ plus people, etc. And we have the same incidents in the AFL, the rugby. There's been a few things here in Australia where, for example, there's been a commitment stated or a policy document. And then when it comes to it, players have refused to wear the pride jersey, for example, or they won't participate in a pride round. So it happens kind of everywhere. And I think there's many reasons for it, but I think one thing is that the organizations kind of do it a bit of a half-assed attempt and they don't fully commit and they don't have like a proper diversity management plan around how to do it. And understanding that if there are religious players or people with strong religious backgrounds who may resist it, how are you going to deal with that? Because what's happened is they just don't and they don't navigate it. And I think with the whole sport and politics doesn't mix, we have a narrative here, especially of sport should be about sport and you shouldn't involve politics, and stop trying to put like LGBT stuff down our throats and things like that. And it was kind of similar with the NHL pride stuff. It's like, right, you're saying and you've been an early adopter in some of these things, but then when it comes to it, you're banning pride tape. But there might be other instances where you kind of support various bits of diversity. So I think it kind of highlights the fact that for many sports organizations, LGBTIQA plus inclusion is still not done very well, and they don't know how to engage with it. They see it as too political. I've had conversations over the year when I started my charity Pride to Play around trying to get sports organizations to kind of engage. And honestly, I could write a book around the whole reasons as to why people don't. There's no market for it. Commercially, it's risky. The commercial sponsors don't want us to be doing it. There's just a whole list of reasons as to why they don't want to engage. And I think some of them, when they do it, they do it quite privately, because if they do it publicly, they know that they're going to get backlash. And I know that Tennis Australia in particular have been, who I do work with, full caveat, but like they put stuff out on their social media at the Australian Open saying we have the Pride Day, and they've got a long reach. Like years ago, there was bits of comments and resistance and stuff, but they kind of engage with it and they do that. Whereas many now will just bury their head in the sand and they won't do anything public. It's like, oh, we're just going to do it behind closed doors because they don't kind of want to do that. But I think it's really important for sports organizations to actually be public, because otherwise it's just reinforcing this idea that LGBT people should be hidden or we shouldn't speak about it and it's taboo. So there's a kind of a lot going on around it. But I think it just shows you that there's still these ongoing controversies and the actions don't match their commitments, whether it's spoken or written.
Even worse than that. I mean, I think the NHL has sided with the far right. I think if we look at the timing of the ban on pride tape, if we look at it's not just a ban on pride tape, it was a ban on all pride nights. The pride tape was rescinded when players just actually refused to follow the pride tape ban and started just themselves using pride tape again. I think we can't leave our activism up to these large corporate capitalist institutions. They are not going to lead the charge in terms of inclusion. It's not in their interest. And we've seen the NHL flip-flop and be really fickle. The own culture of hockey is one that has never been the culture of men's elite level hockey. And I want to be really clear, because women's sports and their old men's sports and children's hockey operate in a different framework, I think. But the hockey that comes to define the nation often is this elite men's level hockey. It's one that's never been particularly open to queerness, despite the If You Can Play project, which really was basically a sign that said, if you look, act, and do exactly the same as we do and don't express gender in any way that's at all transgressive, you are welcome to come to our team. And by the way, don't talk about who you're sleeping with. I think we've seen the NHL, really capitalize on movements on the far right in terms of looking for fanship in the same way that, as Ryan points out, they looked for fans amongst the LGBTQ plus community and sort of move away from that. Just in the same way that as Heated Rivalry becomes like the most important kind of cultural television show, all of a sudden NHL arenas are showing clips on their jumbotrons and celebrating queer identities again. And I think we see the fickle nature and why this is about, supporting capitalism, supporting audiences, and not about actually celebrating diversity, celebrating identity, celebrating gender inclusion and diverse sexualities. It's really about padding the NHL's bottom line and supporting its owners. And so I caution us to be really careful about leaving our activism to an institution like the National Hockey League.
Just picking up on that, it's a really great point, and one, so I've written another conversation article about it, but I'm actually really fascinated about it, and it's about, on your point about activism, heteroactivism. So it's a specific form of resistance to the advancement of LGBTIQ plus equalities, and they have done a very, very good job infiltrating sports organization and influencing them to the extent they get all their ideas and their narratives. And when they put statements out saying certain things, they're all being scripted by these often kind of religious connection bodies. And I know in America in particular, North America, Alliance Defending Freedom have drafted all the bills for the trans things, the trans bans. And I think it's a really good point around, we can't leave the activism to the institutions because there will be activism. So we need to kind of push back against that. And I think, they've done a very good job of working with sports organizations and influencing them.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I saw the other day what is it? I meant to look up the details. Is it USA Hockey that just banned trans people? And people literally within the last week or so, and people are like, what is going on? We have this big show. How do we balance between this new show, which, as you're both saying, can bring more people into the sport? And this goes back to what I think probably many of us talk about in our classes and our research. And what Anna, you and I talked about a lot last year when trying to fight this anti-trans fascist stuff, which is that if they actually wanted to expand how many people can participate in sports, right, they would throw their hands, they would just not have anything to do with any of this far right fascist stuff. But of course, we know they really just want to control and exclude at the end of the day. So I was hoping, Kristi, you could talk a little bit about nationalism, Canadian nationalism, and men's hockey there, which you said they're kind of different forms of it. Not only how men's hockey today is sort of embedded in the white nationalist project, but also how they're a way to push it back against that, disrupt it, reconfigure it. So to what extent do you see this as a possibility with the show, as you kind of mentioned before?
I think it's a possibility, but I think it's limited in the same way. This is a representation. It's really having a cultural moment. Its ability to penetrate what is which men's elite level hockey culture. We'll see. I wish I could be really hopeful about this, but I'm actually not. I mean, men's hockey culture has been really impervious to any form of critique and openness. We've seen that through the scandal that broke in 2022 around the 2018 Men's World Junior Hockey Team and the Hockey Canada cover-up of what appeared to be at the time, which was extremely concerning allegations of sexual violence against a young woman. What the show does in terms of nation, I think also should concern us a little bit. And I think, I love this show, and I'm I'm very celebratory of it. I've watched it several times. I am presently reading the books. I'm super curious. I'm thinking about new ways to think with it. But I think it is also a project around homo-nationalism that really presents Canada and the US as kind of beacons of welcoming for queer folk at the same time that we see that they're not, right? That Russia has become, as Joanna said right off the bat, that Russia is this like terrible place. You couldn't possibly be out in Russia. And actually, when I look to Russia and think about like who are their national symbols, I think about people like Rudolf Nureyev, who was, probably the world's most famous ballet dancer, who was queer his entire life, was a national symbol in Russia. You can think about, the song by Tattoo, which was, largely generated, but is, a story and a song that's fabricated, but about two lesbians that actually figures very prominently in actually the bar scene in Heated Rivalry. That being queer, there are limits, but there are limits in Canada too. And I think Canada sort of walks away. There's a specter sort of haunting the actors, the show, that they can't be out, but nobody really blames hockey culture, which has been incredibly resistant to diverse sexualities and even diverse gender identities. Like, being quote unquote soft in any way is highly stigmatized. And that in some ways, shows the sort of mapping of gender onto sexuality, that this is actually what's happening there. It's about a real loathing of the feminine, and that gayness in particular becomes associated with forms of femininity that are not tolerated in these hockey spaces. But at the same time, I clearly don't have to tell you, we're at a moment where there's like intense trans panic in an attempt to wipe trans children off the map in both Canada and the US. We've seen this, here in Canada. Danielle Smith in Alberta has just put out anti-trans legislation for children. The same thing, we had an attempt at something similar in my own province of New Brunswick. We've seen several US states. We've seen the attempt to ban all trans women from sport practice. This is not picked up as part of this larger thing, but we don't know if Ilya Rozanov could go back to Russia and be okay. We know that cities like Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other large cities have large queer communities that are open, that are out, that are living their lives and have for ages, including queer national icons. And so I think it's not well balanced in that way, but I think it's doing a lot of work to absolve Canada and the US, the NHL, and others of their, it tells a meaningful story about what's going on in these places as well. And I think it's one that we might want to be a little bit critical of.
No, and I think that's such an important point, because that question of queer inclusion, as we all have touched on in our work and in conversations we have, like, it is so increasingly and incredibly politicized, not just in North America, but Ryan and I, we've talked about it in Australia, in the UK. It's global. And I really liked your point, Kristi, about how it's not really meaningfully engaged in the show. I think it is really interesting in hearing like Hudson Williams and Connor Story, who play Shane and Ilya respectively. I came across, because I've been going down the rabbit hole of Heated Rivalry reels, as I imagine all of us to an extent are. But there was a really interesting interview they did in which they make a comment about how Heated Rivalry was initially pitched to a US based company, but there were so many notes and proposed changes that Jacob Tierney, who creator, writer, director, executive producer, moved the production to Canada. Having a smaller budget, like they reuse the scene of the running with like the terrible running form for Scott Hunter, which is funny. But in that, Story makes the point, I don't think we could have made the show that we did in the US. And of course, now the show is not only popular in Canada, but in the US, to the point of being the top rated non-animated acquired series on HBO Max. And I say all this because while I think we all agree, like it doesn't meaningfully engage the gravity of the current moment. But do you think, there is a way that the show could move the needle on some of those cultural norms? Or if not, what would the show need to do, maybe in like season 2 or in the hubbub around it, to start meaningfully moving that needle around masculinity, heteronormativity, and whiteness?
think it sends a powerful message to the public largely, but I don't think that message will penetrate hockey culture. I think that's the thing of it is that institution is, men's hockey culture is a closed institution. It produces its athletes who come out the other end, who go back in and coach, and it's a cyclical process. And I think, for me, there were parliamentary committee hearings after the allegations that Hockey Canada had covered up an alleged sexual assault. And when the people from Hockey Canada came to the parliamentary committee meetings, the entire country was calling for them to resign. And they consistently said things like, "Well, I give my colleagues an A. We're the people who can transform this institution." At the same time, the entire country was calling for them to resign. I think it spoke volumes about how close that institution was. I mean, anybody who was paying even a little bit of attention knew that this was not going to stand. And yet they hung on for I think, 2 weeks before the board resigned. And I think those are things we have to keep in mind. There have been moments of crisis in hockey culture. There's been, shows and critiques and different ways of thinking about this, calls for change, and they've gone unheeded. So I'm not convinced that, this program, as wonderful and joy producing and exciting as it is really going to move the needle that way. What needs to happen? I think that's a really hard, it requires an entire institutional shift that I'm not sure that people in this country are ready to see.
Yeah, just going on from that, I think it's whether these sports organizations take notice and listen. Like if you're a board member or you're executives and you're like, we're hearing, we're seeing this, what are we missing? Or we need to get onto this, or we need to respond to fans because they do kind of want this. And I think that's on Kristi's point. Are they willing to listen? Probably not. Like there's evidence around, there's a whole market here that wants to be included, that wants to engage with your product as a business, let's say, but you're not willing to do any of the work to do it. You can't just slap a rainbow on, you can't have any Pride nights. Like the Pride night is a really interesting one for me because they've taken off here and there's an organization here, but some organizations think, oh, if we do a Pride night, it will solve all our problems. It will make homophobia go away, transphobia. It's going to basically be the magic bullet. And often more than not, we've had an incident with Josh Cavallo, the football player who came out. He's moved to the UK and basically said his old club, he had issues with homophobia, but this club and this like Pride night and stuff was put on this pedestal of being like absolutely amazing. And then what we found, it's actually not done what it was maybe supposed to achieve, and it's actually caused problems. So I think what sports can do, though, I think a small step that I would like to kind of see is just start the conversations. So if the Heated Rivalry starts a conversation amongst executives or board members, or, hey, what can we do to maybe address this problem, or what can we start to do? Because I think from my perspective, like many years ago when I was starting the charity, I had to go out and speak to these sports, and I would ultimately be trying to beg them to do something and to work with us and things like that. And get in a conversation just to speak about what the sport could do for LGBTIQ plus communities was not easy. So if they can start a conversation and start the dialogue, then that for me would be really good, because then we can kind of move forward. But from my research perspective, what I found is that many, especially senior executives in sports, are not willing to have a conversation about this. I remember once when I first started, I was told, somebody said that they'd been told that I was a troublemaker and not to work with me. Like, wear that as a badge of honor, but it's because they don't even want to speak to me, because you hold them to account or you make them uncomfortable because they realize they're not doing anything. And many of them will tout that we're a sport for all, we welcome every Australian, we want to do this and we do that. And it's like, well, you're not walking the walk in that regard. So yeah, so if it starts a conversation, and a meaningful one, between the sports and LGBT communities, because we still have many sports who will try and do work without any community development, like trans policy stuff. I'll be reviewing policies for sports and I'd be like, have you consulted any trans athletes or broader LGBT communities? And be like, oh no. And I'm like, what? So yeah.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think part of what everyone's getting at too, that we've already mentioned, is sort of like the role that fan culture could play. And I think one thing that's been interesting, and this is more of like a comment than a question, sorry, is that seeing a lot of people say, you know, like if the NHL and if men's hockey in the US, Canada, whichever, is sort of like too homophobic, like just go to the PWHL and go to those games. And I find that really interesting as someone who is not, I always say, like, I'm not much of a sports fan in the sense, like, I don't follow it actively. Like, I kind of follow it as I see things happen. I just wanted to mention amazing sports journalist in front of the show, Frankie De La Creta, wrote about how all these people kept telling them, why are you continuously critiquing men's hockey? Just go to the PWHL. And she's like, duh, I know, like, I do go to the PWHL. And then they shared how they actually went to a game, I think between Boston and Seattle, a PWHL game. And there was like a guy that was basically like hate watching the game and just like disparaging the women's players over and over and over, and how it just like really destroyed the environment for them and their family. And they were like, you know, like usually women's sports games, like the atmosphere is amazing, super affirming, really great for me, great for my family, great for community, all these things. And so it's really interesting this is happening at the rise, like in the middle of the rise of interest in like women's sport generally, and all the kind of problems we're seeing, excitement we're seeing around it, but also the problems with what happens when the fan base kind of gets a whole lot bigger, and money is still obviously a really big factor. So yeah, I find that really interesting, how fans themselves are kind of navigating what should we do, who should we be supporting.
And I think for any fan out there who's LGBTQ plus, don't accept feeling unsafe or not going. Everybody has the right to go to a stadium or to watch sport. And this idea, sometimes I hear it, or you can go to a queer sports club or Pride night. No, everyone should have the right to safety and to go and consume sport in a way that everyone does. And if anybody ever has any problems, push back against it, report it, make the sport do something, because they do not have a right to make people feel like that.
Absolutely. And I really like that in terms of it's both the responsibility of sport organizations to do better, however feasible or unfeasible that is, but also that agency exercised by fans as well. Particularly, as you said, Johanna, like those women's sports spaces have historically been safer, whatever safer means, but like it's now being infiltrated and drawing into question of like, yes, they're getting the publicity they so deserve, but at what cost, and how do we continue pushing back to be better and to make sport, reimagine sport into an actually holistically inclusive space in that. Okay, so final question, because I just like talking about the show. Also, this is important, but also the show. So what do you hope to see in season 2? Not just maybe in terms of plot lines and character development, but also in the context of this conversation we've had about the kind of ways that North American sport are presented, masculinity. Like, what would you hope for a season 2 in Heated Rivalry?
I think it'd be so nice to see good modeling in the dressing room. Like, what does this look like as the players come out, and some models, some good behavior about, you know, how that looks. That'd be really nice. Brian's probably got to jump on this. He said he's read all the books, and I feel like Jacob Tierney's followed the books pretty closely, so might have a better sense of what to expect in season 2. But I mean, for me, just I hope it doesn't, like, I don't know how to describe this, but the show felt like kind of a hug. It felt warm, it felt inviting, it felt cozy. It was things that many people watched it more than once. I would hope it doesn't lose that, because I think there's something really special happening there in terms of opening up these conversations, and that it feels good to talk about it, to be with your friends celebrating it. And I hope we can continue to do that in season 2.
So I haven't read the long game yet because I've strategically waited. So basically I'm going to ride out for as long as I can about Heated Rivalry, and then when I'm getting withdrawal symptoms, I'm going to go in and read the long game. I've seen a few spoilers on social media, and I've tried to kind of keep away from them. And I have an idea about the 3, because there's a 3rd book coming out, and I've seen something about what general the gist is. So the first one is obviously about the kind of relationship coming together. And I think the second one is kind of about maybe the advancement of the relationship. And then the 3rd one was about the sports organizations and the league and homophobia and things like that. I'm very keen to see how it navigates with the sport and how that's represented. And for example, what research they might do or background to understand how the leagues might respond and the executives in the conversation. So I'm particularly really interested in the after they've kind of established themselves, how they navigate the league and what the response is and things like that. Because sometimes I think as well with the Josh Cavallo football case here, it's celebrated when they come out. But from my perspective, what I think is sometimes these sports are throwing them to the wolves because they're not doing anything to help or protect them. And then what happens is he's being subjected to a lot of homophobia, hateful comments online. It's like, it's not just about the process of supporting someone to come out, it's what has been done afterwards and how can the sport kind of protect them, because they're an employee at the end of the day. They have a duty of care to look out for their welfare. So I'm really interested in kind of that and seeing how the dynamic in the relationship develops between the two as well.
I would say personally, I thought I saw somewhere like a response to a critique that basically one of her books either does or is supposed to also deal with sexual assault within the sport. And I don't know if that's related to the sports organizations. I saw this as like a brief comment, so I have not actually looked into it to verify, but I really hope, because I think that would be really important. We are going to wrap it up there. Thank you both so much for all of your expertise and brilliance and generosity, and just joy for the show. This was just such a lovely conversation.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you so much for giving me another opportunity to talk about this and not drive my partner and my friends insane. So it's great to have an outlet for this. Thank you.
Hold on.